Looking for an idyllic family getaway? Perhaps you're after some old-fashioned American hospitality, or even somewhere quiet to finish that novel you've always wanted to write? Then Jerusalem's Lot is the perfect place for you. Spend a pleasant evening at the park, or grab a delicious ice cream from Spencer's, all whilst enjoying fantastic views of the Marston House. You'll have a great night's sleep at Eve's boarding house, where you can rest soundly under the shadow of the Marston House. Fancy some nightlife? Well, Dale's is the place to be. With music played and drinks served into the early hours of the morning, you'll always get home safely by orientating yourself with the Marston House. Maybe shopping will take your fancy. If so, make sure you pop on by the brand new antique shop, recently opened by the brand new owners of the Marston House. With a colourful history and a friendly and welcoming atmosphere, Jerusalem's Lot is the place to visit this summer. It's funny how, and I'm sure this is true for lots of constant readers, for me as well, that I have so many memories of reading Stephen King in my youth. And there's nothing particularly young adult or YA at all about any of Stephen King's writings. In fact, most of his writing is incredibly adult, really, when he doesn't really shy away from sex, drugs, gore. But despite, or maybe because of all those things, Stephen King, for me, was a perfect transition from kind of books aimed at young teenagers or younger audience to adult books. I mean, my first taste of Stephen King was Cell, which I don't think is a usual starting place for people who read Stephen King, but a family friend had read it, lent it to my dad, and then I read it. And after, that was my kind of first taste, and I was definitely, after that first taste, definitely hungry for more. And then when I was in year 10, actually, I won an end of year kind of award at my school for some kind of achievement in French, which I can't speak a word of French, but I won the award for French. I must have been like 14 at that time, and the prize we got to select was kind of any book we wanted up to kind of the value of £20, and I asked for Salem's Lot. So Salem's Lot was published in 1975 and is Stephen King's second published novel. It tells the story of a small town in Maine which is slowly being taken over by vampires. And obviously, before I get into like a spoiler-filled discussion on the book, I will say this. I enjoyed Salem's Lot a lot more than I did Carrie. I mean, it's an incredibly effective novel, and I think becomes the kind of blueprint for a lot of what is to come in Stephen King's work. That being said, I think the individual elements are improved upon in some of the kind of later works and later books that I've read by Stephen King. The small town being slowly infiltrated is perfected in Needful Things, and a lot of the kind of themes of this novel are also revisited in it to, I think, an even greater effect. So, I'll just say before I get into spoilers, I really enjoyed this novel, but I think he's perfected the formula later on. Anyway, that being said, I'm going to really get into some kind of spoiler territory now. So if you haven't read it yet, do yourself a favor, go out, find a copy to read, or if you're still not sure you want to read it, or you're still not sure, why don't you just kind of pull up a chair and let me see if I can convince you to read it, the same way that King convinced me that vampires exist. So this is Stephen King's second published novel, as I mentioned, and it marks a departure from Carrie. For one thing, it's a lot longer, and although it does have kind of clippings from newspapers and inserts from kind of other sources apart from the main narrative, it is told in a much more traditional style. Carrie is a short, mostly character-focused novel, I think, and whilst this is still very much focused on characters, there are a lot more characters. There's a whole town full of these characters to kind of explore, and King explores them in much more detail, I think, than the kind of the other characters in Carrie, and invites us into their homes a lot more. It's not just focused on the protagonist. It's more traditional in plot as well. I think this is more of a horror story that turns into like a good versus evil tale, and there are kind of those usual writerly tricks used here. So some of the same tricks actually that used in Carrie. The novel starts with two characters who ran away from Salem's Lot, reading newspaper articles which give clues to an event that has already taken place. So as with Carrie, we know that something bad has happened, and we just don't know exactly kind of what's happened or how we got to this point, which lends obviously the novel a great deal of tension, suspense from the start, makes you want to turn the page more. This time, though, the opening prologue, I think, does more than just add suspense. It's not just saying something bad happens for the tragedy. It's actually, to me, lends the novel one of its themes, which is this idea of going back into the past or into childhood traumas and having to confront them in order to move forward. And that's like kind of central, I think, to the character, the main character in the novel, which is Ben Mears. I think that's central to his character. It's said that there are a lot more characters in this novel, and I think you can kind of break them down into three main groups. I think you've got like the heroes, you've got the vampires, and you've got the townspeople. There are probably two characters who don't fit into these groups, so that would be, for me, the town itself, so Jerusalem's Lot, and the Marston House. I think both of them on their own are these two separate characters. So Jerusalem's Lot is a small town in Maine. It was incorporated in 1765 and named after a pig that had ran away. It is a town which is slowly dying, with not enough kids to have its own high school, and instead sharing like one high school with two other towns. It has a shopping centre soon to be built kind of on the main road, like away, which is going to take more business away from the town. So it's this kind of old town which is slowly dying. These are the town's secrets, and some will later be known, and some will never be known. The town keeps them all with the ultimate poker face. The town cares for the devil's work no more than it cares for God's or man's. It knew darkness, and darkness was enough. In a fantastic passage in the novel, King describes how the town knows darkness. It knows the evil that is coming. In this same passage, he also links the town to three things, which is the land the actual town's built on, the buildings themselves, and the people. And he describes how the town's people are, they're tied to the land, almost unable to move away. Almost as if the town is holding the people there in its kind of sway, the same way that the victims in the book are almost hypnotized by Barlow, one of the vampire characters. It's kind of no surprise then that the two people who eventually get away from the town in the end of the novel are both the newcomers to the town. They've not been quite caught in its sway yet. King also talks about how the buildings are old and how many are false fronted, that most people know that they are facades and that there is nothing really behind them. And that could be true for Salem's Lot, apart from one building, which is the Marston House. In the same passage, King talks about, working the hard land and ending up with kind of a great weed-choked pile. I think if the land of Salem's Lot is tough, the Marston House is the weed, slowly growing and invading through the rest of the town, pumping evil into it. The Marston House is a kind of a psychic beacon, it's described as, that has absorbed evil and pulsates with evil, an evil that calls other evil, but also an evil which infects. The vampires are scary in this story. There's no getting around it. It is a scary vampire story, but to me, the Marston House is scarier. This house, which is inhabited by Hubie Marston, who had like rumors of occult sacrifices, and then there was a murder-suicide with his wife. Actually, it's worth mentioning that Hubie's wife's sister says that she felt the moment her sister died, even though, she was states away. Like, obviously, there's a psychic connection there, which, whilst this book may be very different from Carrie, the last book we read, or the first Stephen King novel, the psychic abilities do play a small part of this world. It's still occupying that same kind of realm, and Hubie Marston was an evil man. And it also turns out he was at some point in communication with Barlow, so the main vampire of the story. And the evil house is like kind of reaching out and calling more evil in, which does bring me to one of like the big themes of the book. And if I'm honest, one of the big themes of much of Stephen King's work, I feel, which is this kind of age-old cosmic battle of good versus evil. And if the Marston house is evil, and Hubie Marston is evil, and the town is slowly being infected with this evil, then Barlow and Straker are kind of the evil incarnate, like in this novel. They are the face of evil. Barlow is our kind of original vampire. If you've seen the miniseries, you might have pictures of him as like more of a Nosferatu type vampire, but in the novel, he is closer to kind of a Dracula. He starts off old, but his appearance gets younger the more he feeds or drinks, and he seems to have this kind of classic range of vampire powers. So he has super strength, the ability to turn to mist, the blood sucking, which turns others into vampires, and also a way to hypnotize others. He can't go out into sunlight, and he has to be invited in order to kind of come into your house. Whereas Straker, his counterpart, is kind of his familiar, the human who's there to kind of do his bidding, and he can move around during daylight hours and kind of lays this kind of path for his master, like to infiltrate the town. Like they arrive in town under kind of the guise of antiques dealerships and or an antique shop, and Straker arrives first and says that his master is kind of away on a buying trip, but to prepare for Barlow's arrival, we feel like it is Straker who maybe kidnaps Ralphie Glick, or Barlow does this and then is one of the kind of first victims of the vampires, and they end up sacrificing him, making a pact with some kind of bigger evil, in a really, really chilling scene. There was no sound but that brought on by the breeze. The figure stood silent and thoughtful for a time. Then it stooped and stood with the figure of a child in his arms. I bring you this. It became unspeakable. It's always tempting to try and see what kind of metaphor the vampires are standing in for. You could look at the fact that the vampires in this novel are Europeans, they are to the townspeople foreigners, and tie it in with some kind of anti-rich colonizer message. Although I rather think that the nationality is more to do with the Dracula influence. King has also said about how this novel was akin to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, although not really about the Red Scare and more about the distrusting government that kind of came about in the 60s and 70s, all the kind of corruption. And to me, there are, when I say vampires as a character group, there are three main characters that I label as under the kind of head of vampires, and obviously you have Barlow and Straker, but I also consider, and again, this is not including the townspeople who just get turned, like the cannon fodder, the vampire fodder, but I also consider Larry Crockett a vampire. I mean, the man sells out his town for his own gain. He hypnotizes his lackeys through money rather than through hypnotism, and through his kind of real estate ventures. He is slowly bleeding his own town to death. He's the face of corporate America at this point, which is conning the hard-working small owners out of their homes. And he's also in league with Barlow and Straker from the beginning. If they can't come to the town without an invitation, he is the one who invites them in. And these three and the town people who are turned into vampires, they kind of become, like I said, the face of evil. But King writes this evil like it's like a tangible force, like a cosmic force that is moving its kind of own chess pieces or on a board, like against the will of good. And through fate or luck, evil seems to have kind of its own mind. And Barlow may be the face of evil here, but evil is more like an omnipotent force in a battle against good that's taken part in this town. So there are the evil players. Who do we have on the side of good? And good also seems like a force itself, moving its own chess pieces. And it's kind of evident when two of our characters meet at the beginning, like straight away, and they feel an instant, really easy connection to each other. Coincidences which aren't coincidences, which could be seen as fate pulling them towards each other. And so our first kind of character we meet is Ben Mears, and this really is the kind of prototypical Stephen King leading man. Ben is the first of many author protagonists that we have in Stephen King novels, and having knowing that he has spent some time in the lot as a young kid, he's returning to exercise these demons of his past. And as a kid, Ben entered the Marston house on a dare, only to find the hanging corpse of Hubie Marston, who obviously was dead years ago. So it was like a ghost or a psychic vision of, or it could have been a child's overactive imagination. But either way, that image has been haunting Ben. The house has wormed its way into his brain, and he's returned to write a book about the Marston house, hoping to rent out the house, but finding that it's already been purchased, and also dealing with the death of his wife in a freak motorcycle accident. So we find out he was driving but escaped unscathed. Actually, come to think of it, if I did have a big fault in this book, it's that this backstory of Ben's wife is kind of proffered up but never really explored. It's a superficial kind of character trait, which is the cause for some town gossip later on in the book, but doesn't really go further than that. It almost seems unimportant or kind of inconsequential for Ben. Maybe it becomes a bit too throwaway when it could have been developed out into so much more, knowing that he's coming back to town to exorcise the demons of something that scared him as a kid. Maybe this is a bigger problem that you might want to exercise, this idea of your wife dying. But anyway, soon after arriving at Salems Lot, Ben runs into Susan Norton, who is a young woman who is kind of fast outgrowing her small town, and it kind of plays like this scene like a meet cute where Ben notices that she's reading one of his books at the park, and again, is this coincidence or is it fate? They bond really quickly and easily. They talk over ice creams and then arrange a dinner. They both seem to feel kind of drawn to each other. It kind of says that in the novel, like there's something that's drawing them and making it easier for them. Some kind of external force laying out a path for them. And with Susan, I think she's like this other symptom of the dying small town. She's a smart young woman longing to get out, at odds with her mother about the life she dreams of for herself, where her mother wants her to stay in the town, to marry a local boy, to repeat the cycle of her life, or her mother's life, whereas Ben is an outsider who kind of represents everything Susan wants and everything that her mother fears. And then there's more to this group. So Ben also, the good guys, Ben also meets a teacher named Matt Burke. And then Matt, I would say, if you're looking at the classic Dracula story, is the Van Helsing of the group. And whilst I really liked his character and really enjoyed all his interactions with Ben, he kind of mainly becomes the conduit from which we get all of our information from, lying in his hospital bed. And after he has his own confrontation with a vampire, he researches everything we need to know and then kind of just dumps out a lot of exposition for us. So from that kind of start, from Ben, Matt and Susan, we can kind of feel like this group being pulled together, like say a group on the side of good. And if you've read the Dark Tower series at all, you might even call this a quartet. We then get Matt's doctor, Dr. Cody, a physician who equates kind of modern medicine to a kind of magic. He believes it is faith-based, kind of, doctors don't always know why a cure works, but they believe in it. I think he says something about not knowing why ibuprofen works, but they know it works. And then rounding out this group of kind of our heroes is Father Callahan and Mark Petrie. And Mark is one of my favourite characters in this book. So Mark is a young boy, definitely one of my favourites, or at least I think probably one of the most interesting characters in there. He's described as like an almost like a sensitive small boy, but introduced to us using like his own intelligence to embarrass the school bully. He's a kind of kid who spends a lot of time building universal monster figures. Like he's actually friends with the two kids, Danny and Ralphie Glick, who do disappear and are kind of our first town vampires. And they were going to visit Mark at the beginning of the story. And obviously with those two, you get the kind of the scene that's made kind of really famous from the TV movie where Danny appears at Mark's window, tapping on it and inviting him in. But Mark, unlike a lot of other characters in the book, is actually successful at repelling him. And this is the second time we see someone repel a vampire successfully. And it's the difference in this kind of aftermath that I find most interesting, why Mark's such an interesting character. So when Matt Burke repels the vampire at his house, he has a heart attack. When Mark does it, he just goes back to sleep. The night before, Matt Burke had faced such a dark thing and had been stricken by a heart seizure brought on by fright. Tonight, Mark Petrie had faced one, and 10 minutes later lay in the lap of sleep, the plastic cross still grasped loosely in his right hand like a child's rattle. Such is the difference between men and boys. It's obviously interesting as well that they use the kind of age-old cross, both of them as well, like the crucifix. But I also think in this passage, King talks about the ossification of the imaginary faculties, that like children have to kind of go to bed and sleep with these terrors every night, and it only kind of stops like their fears of what's under the bed when they become an adult, and when they're an adult, their imaginations aren't as wild. And I think it's telling like that the two people who survived the ordeal of dealing with the vampires are a child, and Ben, who is a writer who flexes this kind of his imagination all the time, and also is tied to a childhood terror that he can't let go of. It's like this closeness to childhood imagination that allows them to believe in the vampires easily. And I believe but it's not just their belief in the evil that exists, but also their kind of belief that there is a goodness that can defeat it. So, Mark can go to sleep because he believes he's defeated it. Whereas this is where I think it's really important then to compare to Father Callahan. Whereas Father Callahan, wants to face something. He wants to have kind of a test of faith. But the problem when he has the showdown with Barlow in Mark's house, actually, even though he had, he's already seen miracles, like he touches a door and it kind of bright light flashes and bursts open. So he's seen kind of these miracles and things that would make you believe, but he believed more in the evil of Barlow, but did not have that kind of the faith in his own God, that his own goodness could save or defeat this evil. And it's this lack of belief that completely undoes Father Callahan. And perhaps the most horrific sequence of the book, Father Callahan is made to drink Barlow's blood, and this kind of taints him, and he's allowed to leave Salems Lot. He doesn't get turned to vampire, he doesn't killed, but he's kind of tainted and can no longer kind of enter churches. By the time we get to the end of the novel, most of the town folk have been turned, all apart from like the police chief, who kind of in a real cowardly move just gets out of Dodge, even though he kind of knows vampires are there. So by the end, this group, we've got Matt Burke is dead, Dr. Cody is dead, Susan's been turned into a vampire and actually staked by Ben. And I think this act of why I think Ben was the one who had to cement Staker re-cemented Ben's belief that they could defeat Barlow. It was kind of his test of faith, and even in a final confrontation after finding out that Barlow had been sleeping in the cellar of the place where Ben was staying, Ben manages to stake and kill Barlow. And I think he believes it. If he didn't believe he could do it, he wouldn't have done it to Susan because he loved her too much. But yeah, so after this kind of final confrontation, Mark and Ben just get out of town and head to a small border, like kind of town near the Mexican border. This is kind of where the prologue of the book starts. And this is where I think that Ben recognizes the kind of trauma in Mark, the same trauma that maybe was in him after seeing Hubie Marston. And that's affected him his whole life. So realizing at that point that they have to go back, the two of them, and really exorcise these demons, and also just go back and get rid of the vampires. So they do go back to town, and after waiting for the same kind of conditions as the fire that we've heard about in Jerusalem Lot's past, Ben and Mark go and set fire to the Marston house and just start a fire that's going to take out the whole town and theoretically any vampires that are sleeping there during the day. But this very much is very symbolic to me of them revisiting and moving past these events. He actually burns down the house that he was so scared of. But it's also very much symbolic of kind of how you destroy a weed. And so the Marston house is kind of this weed of evil. And to destroy a weed, you can't just put it out. You just need to burn out all the roots. And I think that's what this fire is symbolic of just trying to burn out this evil. And while the novel does focus on supernatural a lot of the time, I still feel that the most horrific moments, like with all good King, are the most human ones. So when Sandy McDougal punches her infant son near the beginning of the book, it's quite a jarring moment. It actually jars me more than any jump scare in the book. And then there's also the scene later on when she's trying to kind of force feed like the baby's lifeless body, and it just might be the most horrific moment in the book or any Stephen King book. But her anguish also makes you feel for her at this point. Stephen King has a real knack for that, making you feel sometimes for the kind of horrible characters. And the same way, like you've got Tony Glick, who breaks down at his son's funeral. This book is a lot scarier than Carrie, but for me it also has a lot more emotional depth to it. This is especially true when talking about Ben staking Susan, and perhaps this kind of idea of the horror in everyday life is one of the best examples for King's talent doing this. It's kind of later on in the novel where we find out that Reggie Sawyer, who's one of his other town characters, has been kind of constantly assaulting his wife, like Bonnie, after catching her having an affair. And it's just these kind of horrific details that juxtaposed against the supernatural horrors that King does so well. So knowing that whilst our main group are fighting vampires, there's this kind of really seedy horribleness that's going on elsewhere in the town behind closed doors. So after all that, we are left with, from Stephen King, he's given us a whole new town in Maine that we can add to our map, and a town, actually whose backstory I'm going to be looking at in another video when I kind of look at a prequel short story that King wrote called Salems Lot. He also, after this, gave us a sequel of sorts, which I'm also going to look at, called One for the Road, another short story. I'm yet to read any of them, but I'm really excited about reading those and covering them in my next couple of videos. The novel itself has been adapted a few times for television and film. I've actually just bought the original miniseries, so I'm going to hopefully watch that and maybe do a quick short video about my experience of that as well. And what else did Stephen King give us? He gave us a ton of new characters as well. And although almost all of them end up presumably dead at the end of this novel, or a vampire, those of you who have read on, like I say, I have read quite a bit of Stephen King, but not all of it. But obviously, you find out that we will meet Father Callahan. He does appear again and becomes quite a central character in the Dark Tower series. So overall, I think this is top quality Stephen King, and I would happily rate this book about 4 out of 5. I think it would have scored higher. I think it was, when I first read it, a 5 out of 5 book. But because I've already experienced what King does in later novels, and I think he does better with a similar scope and theme on later novels. So yeah, 4 out of 5 for this one. I hope you've enjoyed hope you've been enjoying these videos on Stephen King. I know that as a vlogger or content creator, the more time and experience I have doing these videos, the better they hopefully will become, of kind of experience and training. Annoyingly, so much of Stephen King's early work is also some of his strongest work, so you kind of have I feel like my weakest analysis on some of his stronger work, but hopefully if that's the case, I'll revisit later on. But anyway, next time we'll be looking at The Shining. That's going to be the next book we read. And if you do like this video, please like and subscribe, and may you have long days and pleasant nights.